Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we will venture into the events that transpired within the shadowy peaks of Tennessee in 1916, when a whole family vanished deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Share in the comments where you are watching from and brace yourselves, for this narrative defies all logical understanding. The Appalachians have perpetually been shrouded in enigma. Their thick woodlands, isolated hollows, and scattered settlements formed an ideal backdrop for secrets to be preserved across generations. In Tennessee, particularly in its more secluded areas, families lived in near total self-reliance, distant from towns and reliant on one another for survival. This was an era when contact with the outside world required days, roads were mere dirt paths, and justice was slow to arrive. The Carden family was well known locally. They inhabited a modest, yet tidy homestead near a small community in Cumberland County. The father, James Carden, was an industrious middle-aged man, esteemed by his neighbors. His wife, Martha, tended to the home and children with unwavering devotion. Together, they raised 4 children, whose ages spanned from 5 to 14 years old. They were an ordinary family for the period, confronting the rigors of rural existence with grace and fortitude. During the autumn of that year, a change became noticeable. The closest neighbors, living a few miles off, observed that smoke no longer curled from the Carden chimney each morning as it once had. The children, who often played near the main road, were absent. An uneasy silence descended upon the property, as if the mountains had consumed every trace of life. Weeks elapsed before anyone resolved to investigate. Distance and a respect for privacy were defining traits of that time and place. When a group of local men finally approached the Carden home, they encountered a disquieting scene. The property appeared undisturbed. The front door was locked from within. The windows were shut, and the animals still wandered the grounds, hungry but alive. There were no indications of a struggle or violence. Simply, no one was there. Inside the house, the situation grew more puzzling. The kitchen table was set as if the family was about to dine. Laundry still hung on the line out back. Personal items remained in their usual spots. It was as though the Cardens had evaporated into the air, abandoning the life they had carefully constructed. The investigating men felt a chill. This defied all reason. County authorities were alerted, but investigative capabilities were severely limited then. The local sheriff, William Hodges, visited the property and was as baffled as the rest. He coordinated searches of the surrounding forests, recruiting volunteers from the community. For days, men combed trails, valleys, and hillsides, calling out names and probing every accessible crevice of the rugged terrain. They found nothing. Regional newspapers began reporting on the case. The disappearance of an entire family was unheard of. Speculation flourished. Some proposed the Cardens had fled debts or legal issues, but those familiar with them immediately dismissed this. James was an honorable man with no known enemies or serious financial troubles. Others whispered of supernatural events or ancient curses said to haunt these mountains since time immemorial. Superstition ran deep among the Appalachian people, and tales of mysterious vanishings were woven into local lore. As days became weeks, the inquiry uncovered details that only deepened the mystery. One neighbor reported seeing James Carden walking along the main road 3 days before the disappearance was noticed. He seemed normal, offering his customary nod before continuing toward town. Another resident recalled hearing the usual sounds from the Carden place late into the night, just days before the silence fell. Children playing, an axe chopping wood, life proceeding normally. What perplexed investigators was the utter absence of traces. In an age when people did not vanish without leaving some mark, when every movement imprinted the earth, and small communities knew everyone's routines. How could an entire family simply disappear? Sheriff Hodges sent telegrams to neighboring counties inquiring about the Cardens. He checked travel records, spoke with stagecoach drivers, and inquired at inns and boarding houses. No leads surfaced. The house was searched repeatedly. Each room was examined meticulously. In the parents' bedroom, the beds were unmade, as if recently slept in. Martha's clothes hung in the wardrobe, her few valuables still on the dresser. In the children's room, simple wooden toys lay scattered on the floor. School books, pins, small childhood treasures, everything remained. Nothing had been taken. It appeared the family had stepped out for mere minutes and never returned. The animals on the property told their own tale. Chickens still scratched the yard, and the cow required milking by neighbors who provided temporary care. The family horse remained in its stable, seemingly unused for days. Had the Cardens planned a journey or escape, they would likely have taken the horse or made visible preparations. Yet there were none. Their daily routine had been abruptly and inexplicably severed. Documents found in the home showed James kept a small notebook recording farm expenses and plans. The last entry was dated just 5 days before the disappearance was discovered. He had written about needing to repair a back fence and mentioned buying seeds for the coming spring. These were the plans of someone intending to stay, not preparing a secret departure. The notes were ordinary and practical, devoid of any hint of anxiety or dread. The community was deeply shaken. Gatherings were held in local churches where residents prayed for the family's return and debated increasingly elaborate theories. Some began to recall odd occurrences in the weeks preceding the disappearance. Unexplained lights seen in the mountains at night. Sounds unlike any known animal. A general sense of unease many had felt, but few voiced. Now, with the Cardens missing, these recollections took on a sinister gravity. As autumn yielded to winter, the search grew more difficult. Snow began to blanket the Appalachian trails, transforming the landscape into a vast white shroud that concealed any potential evidence. Sheriff Hodges did not abandon the case entirely, but acknowledged the limitations imposed by nature and resources. He kept the file open, hoping spring would bring new opportunities. Meanwhile, the Carden homestead stood empty, gradually becoming a place locals avoided. People hurried past the road leading there, averting their eyes from the silent house. They spoke of something being wrong with the place, a dark energy that repelled even the bravest. Superstition blended with genuine fear of the unknown, crafting an aura of terror that enveloped the entire region. Cumberland County records indicate attempts were made to contact distant relatives. Martha had a sister in Virginia, hundreds of miles away. When contacted months later, she reported not having heard from the family in over a year. The last letter she received spoke of ordinary farm life, the children growing healthy, and hopes for a visit the following summer, nothing suggesting trouble or plans to leave. The arrival of spring in 1917 brought a renewed search and an unexpected discovery. A group of hunters in a remote mountainous area, roughly 15 miles from the Carden farm, found something disturbing. Fragments of fabric snagged on low branches as if someone had rushed past hastily. The cloth had a simple floral pattern, akin to the dresses rural women wore then. The hunters brought the fragments to Sheriff Hodges, who promptly organized a new expedition. The area was notoriously inhospitable, with deep ravines and dense thickets that made travel arduous. Few ventured there, typically only experienced hunters, or those familiar with the mountain's hidden paths. A simple, frightening question arose. What were the Cardens doing in such a remote and perilous location? For 3 days, men searched the area with determined focus. They uncovered more troubling clues. A small rag doll, the kind a child might carry for comfort, was found half buried under rotting leaves. Farther on, near an icy creek, there were faint impressions in the earth that could have been footprints. but months of rain and snow had erased any clear definition. It was frustrating to be so near potential answers, yet remain in profound ignorance. One searcher, an experienced tracker named Thomas Mackenzie, noted something peculiar. The discovered items were scattered along a line leading deeper into the mountains, increasingly distant from any known trail. It was as if those who passed through were fleeing something or being driven against their will into the Appalachians' most inaccessible depths. Thomas shared his observation with the sheriff, but neither could formulate a fully coherent theory. The discovery of the fabric and the doll rekindled public interest in the case. Newspapers from larger cities like Knoxville and Nashville dispatched reporters. Articles speculated on the family's fate, some suggesting encounters with mountain outlaws, others proposing natural disasters that claimed the family members one by one. A few even wrote of legendary creatures said to inhabit the Appalachians' deepest recesses, being spoken of in hushed tones around campfires. Sheriff Hodges, a pragmatic man, dismissed the most fanciful theories, but could not deny the case defied conventional explanation. He began investigating whether similar disappearances had occurred in the region over the years. His findings were disturbing. Over the preceding 2 decades, at least 7 individuals had vanished in that part of Tennessee without leaving conclusive traces. These were isolated incidents, spaced across time, involving lone travelers or small groups venturing into the mountains. None had been solved. A grim pattern emerged from these old records. Most disappearances happened in autumn or winter, when nights were longer and conditions harsher. The victims were typically outsiders, or those unfamiliar with the area. But the Carden family was different. They had lived there for years, knowledgeable about the trails, natural hazards, and dangers. Why would they venture so far from home, especially with young children? And if they didn't go willingly, what or who had taken them? As the case gained notoriety, testimonies emerged more freely. An elderly woman living nearby revealed that the night before the Cardens were last seen, she had heard screams from the direction of their property. At the time, she thought it was children at play or wild animals. Now, that memory haunted her. She described the sounds as distressed, but brief, as if abruptly cut off. Why had she not mentioned it sooner? Out of fear, uncertainty, and a reluctance to meddle common attitudes in that closed and cautious society. Another account came from a traveling salesman who peddled tools and utensils in the area. He claimed to have seen a group of strange men camped near the Carden property a few weeks before the disappearance. There were 4 or 5 individuals who did not look like locals, kept to themselves, and responded with hostility to approach. The salesman could not provide detailed descriptions, but remembered the sense of danger he felt. By the time the sheriff tried to trace these men, any trail had gone cold. The investigation took a darker turn when old documents were found in the county archives. A clerk sorting through papers came across property records revealing a troubled history for the land where the Cardens lived. Decades earlier, in the early 19th century, violent land disputes had resulted in deaths and disappearances. Entire families had been driven out or had vanished during conflicts over ownership of these fertile Appalachian foothills. What caught Sheriff Hodges' attention was a specific entry from 1843. It noted that certain areas near what would become the Carden property were avoided by the Native Americans who then inhabited the region. According to the record, they referred to the area as a place where spirits were restless, where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. These were ancient beliefs, passed down through generations, which European settlers had largely ignored in their quest for farmland. Hodges was skeptical of superstitions, but could not disregard how historical patterns sometimes revealed hidden truths. He decided to interview the area's oldest residents, those with memories spanning decades. One such person was an 82-year-old woman named Eleanor Wright, whose family had settled in that part of Tennessee before the Civil War. Eleanor received few visitors and lived alone in a modest cabin, but her mind remained sharp. When questioned about the Cardens and the land's history, she fell silent for a long moment, her eyes searching distant, seemingly uncomfortable memories. Finally, she spoke. She told of her grandfather, who had witnessed strange events in the region in his youth. Families that thrived would suddenly fall into ruin. Children took ill without cause. Animals behaved oddly, and periodically someone would simply disappear. Eleanor mentioned a specific incident her grandfather recounted from 1868. A family of new settlers, the Hartleys, had settled not far from where the Cardens would later live. Within a year, every member of the Hartley family had disappeared. Their property was found empty, showing signs of a hasty departure, but with no known destination. Their fate remained unknown, the story lost among the many mysteries held in the mountain's stony silence. The sheriff asked if Eleanor believed in supernatural explanations. She responded with a question of her own. Did it truly matter whether the danger came from cruel men, unknown beasts, or forces beyond understanding? The outcome was always the same. People vanished, families were destroyed, and the mountain remained indifferent to human suffering. Her words carried the weight of a long life filled with witnessing much, a life that had taught her that not all questions have satisfactory answers. With this information, Hodges returned to the archives with renewed focus. His research uncovered more cases over the years. In 1879, 2 hunters vanished after venturing into the nearby mountains. In 1892, a young woman gathering medicinal herbs was never seen again. In 1904, a family passing through the region asked locals for directions and subsequently disappeared without a trace. The cases were sporadic, separated by years, but followed a disturbing geographic pattern, all occurring within a 20-mile radius of the Carden property. Meanwhile, the Carden house remained vacant. No one wished to take over the land, even though it was productive and well located. Fear had taken deep root in the community. Stories circulated of strange lights seen through the windows at night, of shadows moving across the grounds when no one should be there. Some claimed to hear children's voices playing around the house at dusk, but upon approach, they found only silence and darkness. One particular incident further frightened the population. A brave, or perhaps foolish young man decided to spend the night at the Carden home to prove nothing supernatural was afoot. He entered at dusk, carrying a lantern, some supplies, and a loaded gun for protection against wild animals. The next morning, he was found outside the property, pale and trembling, unable to utter coherent words. When he finally managed to speak days later, he swore that something had tried to break into the house during the night, that he heard scratching on the doors and windows, and that he felt an evil presence so intense he fled before dawn. The summer of 1917 brought sweltering heat to the Tennessee mountains. The Carden case had become an obsession for Sheriff Hodges, consuming his nights and invading his thoughts during the day. He knew he needed outside help, someone with experience handling complex cases beyond the capabilities of a small rural department. So he wrote a detailed letter to the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Nashville, requesting assistance. The response arrived 3 weeks later. An investigator would be sent to assess the case. The man who arrived in Cumberland County on a hot August afternoon was named Robert Chandler. He was a seasoned investigator, 45 years old, who had worked on numerous difficult cases. His reputation preceded him. He was said to have a keen eye for details, others overlooked, and an almost obsessive persistence in searching for the truth. Chandler spent the first few days reviewing all the documentation Hodges had accumulated. He read reports, studied maps, and examined the few objects found during the searches. He visited the Carden property multiple times, walking the grounds at different hours, trying to absorb the atmosphere. He spoke with neighbors, listened to theories and testimonies, and separated fact from speculation. His approach was methodical and patient. One of Chandler's first observations was the lack of evidence of violence. In cases of brutal crimes, there were always traces. Blood was difficult to remove completely, signs of a struggle left marks, and bodies had to be disposed of. But there was none of that here. If the Carden family had been victims of a criminal act, whoever was responsible had performed an extraordinarily meticulous job, and this possibility intrigued the investigator. Something completely different had occurred. Chandler decided to retrace the path the evidence suggested. He started at the Carden house and headed in the direction where the fabric fragments and the doll had been found. It was an arduous journey across uneven terrain, climbing steep slopes and descending shadowy valleys. It took him 2 days to reach the furthest point where objects related to the Cardens had been discovered. There, he stopped and looked around. He was approximately 15 miles from the house, surrounded by dense forest with no visible trails or signs of civilization. Why would anyone come this far? That question echoed in his mind as he studied the terrain. There was no logical destination in that direction. No town, no property, no resources to justify such an arduous journey, especially with small children, unless they were fleeing something so terrible that any direction seemed better than staying, or unless they weren't coming voluntarily, but were being driven or pursued into this absolute isolation. Chandler camped in that region for a night, something few would dare do. He wanted to experience the place as the Carden family might have. As darkness descended, he understood why the area inspired such fear. The sounds of the forest at night were disconcerting. Branches snapped for no apparent reason, shadows moved among the trees, and the wind carried whispers that sounded almost human. Even as a man of science and reason, Chandler felt a primal unease, an instinctive sense that he was not alone. Upon returning to the village, the investigator shared his findings with Hodges. Both agreed they needed to explore new lines of inquiry. Chandler suggested checking for known criminals operating in the area during the fall of 1916. Gangs robbing isolated properties were not uncommon then. Perhaps the Cardens had been victims of an organized group that forced them from their home and subsequently eliminated them in a remote location. Available criminal records were limited, but revealed some potential suspects. There were reports of a group of men who had committed robberies on isolated farms in East Tennessee during that period, described as violent and ruthless. But investigating these individuals now, nearly a year later, would be extremely difficult. Many could have left the state, changed their identities, or simply disappeared into the vast rural regions of the American South. Chandler also considered the possibility that James Carden had involvements his family was unaware of, perhaps gambling debts, associations with bootleggers, or connections to criminal elements. Prohibition had not yet been implemented nationwide, but temperance movements were strong in Tennessee, and a legal alcohol trade already existed in certain areas. Could James have been involved in activities that brought danger to his family? This line of inquiry, however, found no support in the known facts about the man. As the fall of 1917 approached, marking a full year since the Cardens' disappearance, Chandler made a discovery that would change the course of the entire investigation. While reviewing property records in a dusty county archive, he found a document that had previously gone unnoticed. It was a letter written by James Carden just 2 weeks before the disappearance, addressed to an attorney in Knoxville, inquiring about mineral rights on his land. The letter revealed that James had found something on his property. He mentioned unusual rock formations and structures that appeared to have been carved by human hands in ancient times. He expressed interest in knowing whether the discoveries had commercial value and whether he, as the landowner, would have rights to any minerals or artifacts found. the lawyer had responded, advising caution and suggesting a formal appraisal before any action was taken. But there was no evidence such an appraisal had occurred. This information shed a completely new light on the events. Chandler immediately organized an expedition to explore the Carden property in more depth, especially the wooded areas at the back, which had not been thoroughly investigated before. An 8-man team equipped with shovels, ropes, and flashlights spent days combing every inch of the land. What they discovered left everyone astonished. There was indeed a natural opening in the rock, partially hidden by dense vegetation, located about half a mile from the main house. It was an entrance to a cave system extending deep into the mountain. The opening was narrow, easily missed by those who didn't know exactly where to look. But once found, it revealed itself as a portal to a vast and sinister subterranean world. The cold stone walls bore marks that could have been made by primitive tools, suggesting the site had been explored or used by humans sometime in the distant past. Chandler personally led the first descent into the caves. The air inside was humid and carried a peculiar odor, a mixture of wet earth and something harder to identify. The light from their flashlights danced on the walls, creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The men advanced cautiously, mapping the main tunnels and searching for any sign of the missing family. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the constant dripping of water and the echoes of their own footsteps. About 100 meters into the cave system, the team found something that made their hearts race. There were clear signs of recent human activity: boot prints in the muddy ground, the remains of makeshift torches made from twigs and fabric, and lengths of rope tied to rock formations, as if someone had tried to navigate the subterranean labyrinth. Most disturbing of all, they found a piece of fabric that matched the pattern of dresses Martha Carden used to wear, according to witnesses who knew her. The discovery energized the investigation. If the Cardens had entered those caves, why? Were they exploring the formations James had mentioned in his letter? Had they gotten lost in the underground labyrinth and perished in the depths? But this didn't explain why the entire family, including the young children, had descended together. It didn't explain the lack of bodies or other concrete evidence, and it certainly didn't explain the objects found 15 miles away in a completely opposite direction. Chandler ordered deeper explorations. For a full week, teams took turns delving into the caves, mapping every tunnel, every chamber, every fork. They discovered the system was more extensive than they had initially imagined. Some tunnels seemed endless, descending ever deeper into the mountain's bowels. Others ended abruptly in solid walls or chasms beyond the reach of their available ropes. It was an alien world, hostile to human life, where it would be easy to become lost forever. In one of the deepest chambers, approximately 200 meters from the entrance, the explorers found something truly disturbing: engravings on the walls. These weren't the Native American pictographs known in the region. They were different symbols, perhaps more primitive or simply too strange to categorize. Some appeared to represent humanoid figures, others were geometric patterns that defied interpretation. And in the center of one wall, someone had carved something more recent initials that could be interpreted as JC, along with what appeared to be a date, though partially erased. News of these discoveries spread quickly through the community. The already existing fear turned into something close to panic. People began avoiding not only the Carden property, but the entire mountain region. Ancient stories resurfaced with renewed vigor. They spoke of ancient peoples who had inhabited these caves centuries before the Europeans arrived, people who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving only their marks on the stones. Some speculated about ritual sacrifices, secret cults, and horrors the rational mind preferred not to contemplate. Winter arrived again in the Tennessee mountains, bringing freezing temperatures that made further cave exploration impossible. The constant humidity and intense cold created dangerous conditions where hypothermia could kill even the most experienced explorers within hours. Chandler was forced to temporarily suspend the underground search, but that didn't mean the investigation had stopped. On the contrary, he decided to use the time to delve deeper into the historical and anthropological aspects of the case. The researcher traveled to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where he consulted professors specializing in regional history and the native peoples of the Appalachians. One of these scholars, Professor Edmund Whitmore, showed particular interest in the descriptions of the symbols found in the caves. Whitmore was an elderly man with completely white hair and eyes that shone with intellectual curiosity. He had dedicated 40 years of his life to studying the pre-Columbian cultures of the region. When Chandler described the symbols in detail, the professor became visibly disturbed. He mentioned that similar symbols had been documented at only 2 other sites in the Appalachians, both associated with dark legends among Native American tribes. According to these oral traditions, these symbols marked places where the living world intersected with something older and more dangerous. They were warnings, not decorations, places to be avoided, not explored. The tribes that originally inhabited these mountains had learned this lesson through painful experience over generations. Whitmore shared stories he had collected from native elders throughout his research. One told of a time long before the arrival of European settlers when an entire tribe disappeared after entering sacred caves in the mountains. According to legend, they were seeking refuge from enemies during a tribal war. But the caves offered no protection. Instead, they offered something far worse. When warriors from allied tribes finally ventured to search for them, they found only silence and symbols carved into the walls, as if messages left by those who knew they would not return. These stories were fascinating, but Chandler struggled to keep them in perspective. He was a man of facts, not myths. Still, he couldn't ignore the patterns that emerged when he looked at the region's long history. Disappearances had been occurring there for centuries, perhaps millennia. Each culture that inhabited these mountains had developed its own explanations and warnings. The natives had their legends. The early European settlers developed their own superstitions. And now, in the 20th century, people were still disappearing without a satisfactory explanation. Back in Cumberland County, Chandler encountered another intriguing development. An elderly man named Samuel Crawford had approached Sheriff Hodges with information he claimed to have kept for decades. Samuel was 73 years old and had worked as a miner in his youth, exploring the Tennessee mountains for coal and other minerals. He claimed to know the cave system where the Cardens had possibly entered, and he had a disturbing story to tell. According to Samuel, when he was about 25 years old in the early 1870s, his mining team had explored those same caves. They were searching for commercially viable mineral deposits. During the exploration, 3 team members entered a side tunnel and never returned. The others waited for hours, shouting their names and trying to follow them, but it was useless. It was as if the mountain had swallowed them. The mining company eventually sealed that entrance and abandoned the project, paying the families of the missing to keep quiet about the incident. Why hadn't Samuel mentioned this before? He explained that he had signed a legal document pledging not to discuss what had happened under penalty of lawsuits and fines his family couldn't afford. But now, old and nearing the end of his life, his conscience weighed more heavily than any legal threat. He felt he needed to share what he knew, especially after hearing about the Carden's fate. Perhaps his information could help solve the mystery, or at least warn others about the very real dangers of that place. Chandler questioned Samuel in detail about the cavern's topography, about the specific features he remembered. The old miner drew rudimentary maps from memory, indicating forks, larger chambers, areas where the ceiling was particularly low, or where chasms opened without warning. Some of these details aligned with the maps from recent explorations, lending credibility to his testimony. But Samuel also revealed something the newer teams had not yet encountered: a vast, incredibly deep chamber where the air grew thin and strange sounds echoed from tunnels his team had never dared to enter. His description of this deep chamber was particularly unsettling. He spoke of an oppressive feeling that overcame anyone who lingered there for more than a few minutes, a sensation of being watched, of not being alone, even when no one else was visibly present. His companions, the ones who vanished, had mentioned hearing voices calling to them from that very direction. The voices sounded like familiar people, yet it made no sense for them to be there. They had followed these calls and were never seen again. The spring of 1918 brought devastating news to the nation. The Great War in Europe continued to consume lives, and the United States was deeply embroiled in the conflict. Young men from Tennessee were departing for distant battlefields, and the country's concerns shifted to matters far larger than the mystery of a missing family in the mountains. Despite this, Chandler remained determined. The Carden case had become a personal obsession, one he could not abandon. With milder weather, cave exploration resumed. This time, Chandler hired speleology experts from other regions, men experienced with complex cave systems in Kentucky and Virginia. They brought more advanced equipment, longer and stronger ropes, more efficient marking systems, and higher quality flashlights. The goal was clear: to reach the deep chamber Samuel Crawford had described and investigate the tunnels extending beyond it. The most ambitious expedition began on an April morning. 8 men entered the caves carrying enough supplies to stay below for up to 2 days if necessary. Chandler led the group, accompanied by 3 experienced cavers, 2 local deputies, and Sheriff Hodges, who insisted on participating despite the risks. They left 1 man at the entrance with explicit instructions. If they did not return within 48 hours, he was to seek help and organize a rescue. The initial descent was relatively uneventful, following previously mapped routes. But as they advanced beyond the points explored in prior forays, the character of the caves changed. The tunnels grew narrower, the ceilings lower, forcing them to crawl in some sections. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the humidity rose to the point where their clothes became soaked with condensation. The air, though still breathable, carried that same strange odor they had noticed earlier, now more intense in the depths. After approximately 6 hours of careful progress, they reached an area matching Samuel's descriptions. It was a natural chamber of impressive dimensions, roughly 30 meters wide and of similar height. Their flashlights barely managed to fully illuminate the ceiling. Stalactites and stalagmites created formations that, in the wavering light, appeared almost otherworldly. And there, in that vast space beneath tons of solid rock, everyone felt exactly what the old miner had described: an oppressive presence, a visceral sense that they should not be there. One of the cavers, a man named Henry Morrison, had instruments to measure air quality. He conducted tests and confirmed that while oxygen levels were slightly low, it was not enough to explain the extreme discomfort everyone was experiencing. It was something more, perhaps psychological, or something the available science of the time could not detect or explain. Chandler insisted they continue. They had come too far to turn back now without a thorough exploration. On the opposite side of the chamber, several tunnels opened like dark mouths, waiting to devour anyone who ventured through them. The team split into smaller groups, each exploring a different passage, always maintaining visual or auditory contact with the others. Chandler and Hodges followed the widest tunnel, the one that seemed most passable. The walls there displayed more of those strange symbols, now in greater profusion, as if warnings were piling up as they approached something significant. After walking for about 15 minutes, they reached something completely unexpected. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, and there, scattered across the rocky floor, were objects that clearly did not belong. There were rusty mining tools, possibly from Samuel Crawford's time. But there were other, more recent items as well. Scraps of decaying fabric, a child's shoe covered in slime, fragments of a wooden box that might have once contained supplies, and, in the center of the chamber, something that made Chandler's blood run cold, a small prayer book, the kind religious families carried with them. On the first pages, written in careful handwriting, were the names of the Carden family members. Hodges fell to his knees, clutching the book with trembling hands. It was the most solid confirmation they had found yet. The Cardens had been there, in those impossible depths, hundreds of feet below the surface, in a labyrinth where sunlight never reached. But why? How had an entire family, including small children, gotten there? And most importantly, where were they now? Because even here, surrounded by evidence of their presence, there were no bodies, no final answers, only more questions shrouded in ever-deepening shadows. The team meticulously searched the chamber, cataloging every object they found. In addition to the prayer book and the child's shoe, they found the remains of candles, indicating the Cardens had tried to light their way. There were scratch marks on the walls, as if someone had tried to hold on while climbing or being dragged. And in a corner, partially covered by sediment, was something none of them expected: a piece of paper with hastily written words. The handwriting was nearly illegible, hurried by desperation, but a few words could be made out. We follow. Voices. Do not return. The discovery of that fragmented note added a whole new dimension to the mystery. Chandler examined the paper carefully under his flashlight, trying to decipher each word faded by time and humidity. The message was disturbing in its incompleteness. Who had written it? Likely James Carden, given the firmness of certain letters that remained legible. But what did "we follow the voices" mean? Which voices? And why write "do not return," as if it were a warning to others who might find the message? The men remained in that chamber for nearly an hour, searching for more evidence, for any clue that might shed light on the family's ultimate fate. But beyond the objects already catalogued, nothing else was found. It was as if the Cardens had arrived there and then simply ceased to exist. There were no obvious tunnels leading to further accessible depths, no visible chasms into which they might have fallen. It was a dead end, both literally and metaphorically. As they prepared to return, Henry Morrison noticed something peculiar. The air in that particular chamber circulated strangely. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible draft coming from somewhere they couldn't immediately identify. Using a candle, he tested different parts of the walls, observing how the flame reacted. Eventually, he discovered a narrow, almost invisible crevice hidden behind a rock formation. The draft was coming from there, suggesting more caverns beyond spaces not immediately obvious. The crevice was too narrow for a grown man to pass through, but with considerable effort, they could widen it. Chandler made a difficult decision. They didn't have the proper equipment for this type of work right now, and they had already been in the depths for over 12 hours. Fatigue was beginning to affect everyone's judgment, and staying any longer would risk their lives. They decided to carefully mark the spot and return later with appropriate tools to investigate what lay beyond the crevice. The journey back to the surface was exhausting. Each man carried not only the physical burden of exploration, but also the psychological weight of their discoveries. When they finally emerged from the caves, daylight temporarily blinded them. It was late afternoon, and the outside world seemed surreally normal and peaceful compared to the dark depths they had just left. The man who had remained at the entrance greeted them with visible relief, concerned about their delay beyond the initial estimate. Chandler took the found objects for further analysis. The prayer book was carefully dried and preserved. A thorough examination confirmed it belonged to the Carden family. Martha had written notes in the margins, short prayers and reflections dated over the years. The last entry was dated just a few days before her disappearance, a simple prayer of gratitude for her family's health. The irony of those words, given the tragedy that followed, was painful to contemplate. The fragment of paper, with the hurried message, became the subject of intense scrutiny. Handwriting experts were consulted, confirming that the writing matched known samples of James Carden's handwriting, but the meaning remained opaque. Following voices deep within a cave defied all logic. Whose voices? Other lost explorers? Hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen or extreme fear? Or something more sinister that the rational mind refused to consider? A theory began to take shape among the investigators, though no one wanted to fully articulate it. What if James Carden, upon discovering the cave entrance on his property, had decided to explore it? What if, during this initial exploration, he had gotten lost or found something that compelled him to return? What if, for some incomprehensible reason, he then led his entire family into those depths? The theory had huge holes. Why would a responsible father put his young children in such danger? Why not seek help from neighbors or authorities if he had found something significant? The local community reacted to news of the discoveries with a mixture of validation and renewed terror. Their superstitions, previously dismissed as rural ignorance by some, now seemed to have a foundation. The mountains truly hid dangers that transcended common understanding. The Carden property became even more shunned, and some began suggesting that the cave entrances should be permanently sealed, so that no one else would be tempted or compelled to enter this subterranean labyrinth. But Chandler resisted this idea. Sealing the caves would mean abandoning any hope of discovering the full truth. It would leave questions unanswered, allowing the mystery to remain forever unsolved. He was determined to organize one last expedition, this time with adequate equipment, to open that crevice and explore whatever lay beyond. He convinced the authorities to grant him more time and resources, arguing that solving the Carden case could also shed light on the other disappearances that had occurred in that region over the decades. Preparations for the final expedition took several weeks. Chandler recruited the best cavers available in the region, men accustomed to working in extreme conditions and confined spaces. Specialized tools were brought from distant cities, including hand drilling equipment and devices to test rock stability. The team would be larger this time, with 12 men in total, divided into groups with specific roles. Some would remain in the main chamber as support, while others would advance through the crevice once it was widened enough. The date chosen was the 10th of June, 1918. It was a clear day with favorable weather, posing no threat of storms that could cause flash flooding in the underground tunnels. At dawn, the team gathered at the Carden estate, now completely abandoned and beginning to show signs of deterioration. The house seemed to watch them silently as they carried their equipment toward the cavern entrance, a mute witness to all the horrors that had unfolded there. The descent into the deep chamber took less time than the first, as they now knew the route and had established permanent markers along the way. When they reached the spot where the Carden objects had been found, they immediately began work on widening the crevice. It was a delicate and dangerous process. Removing stones from a cave wall always carried the risk of destabilizing structures and causing collapses. Every blow had to be calculated. Each removed stone had to be evaluated for its role in the overall integrity of the formation. After 4 hours of meticulous work, the opening was wide enough for a man to pass through. Morrison, the most experienced in navigating tight spaces, volunteered to be the first to cross. Chandler tied a safety rope around his waist, and the entire group watched as he disappeared through the opening. his flashlight creating dancing shadows that quickly dissolved into the darkness beyond. For long minutes, there was no sound other than the anxious breathing of the waiting men. Then Morrison's voice echoed back, muffled but clear enough to be understood. He had reached the other side and was in a passage that continued forward. He pulled on more rope, indicating he was moving ahead. Chandler and 2 other men followed him through the crevice, leaving the rest of the team in the main chamber with instructions to keep the ropes taut and be ready to pull them back at the first sign of danger. The passage on the other side was wider than they expected, allowing them to walk single file without crawling. Morrison's flashlight illuminated walls displaying geological features distinct from other parts of the cave. Crystals embedded in the rock, small but numerous, reflected the light eerily, creating the illusion of thousands of eyes watching their progress. The floor was more uneven here, with depressions that appeared to have been carved by running water in ancient times, when perhaps an underground river had flowed that way. Now there was only dampness and silence. Approximately 50 meters ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous, but it contained something that stopped the 4 men in their tracks. There was unmistakable evidence of human presence, but not recent. Rudimentary structures made of stacked stones formed what might have been shelters or markers. Fragments of pottery, so ancient they crumbled at the slightest touch, littered the floor. And on the walls were paintings, not the geometric symbols seen earlier, but figurative representations of people, animals, and something else none of them could identify with certainty. Chandler approached the paintings, studying them with growing fascination and horror. Some images were clear enough, groups of people seemingly in procession, moving towards something represented by concentric circular shapes. Other images showed what appeared to be people being consumed or absorbed by these shapes. There was a narrative here, an ancient story told through pigments that had survived for centuries, perhaps millennia, within the protected depths of the cave. It told of a people who had entered these caves and encountered something terrible. Morrison drew the others' attention to a discovery in the far corner of the chamber. Bones, not just a few, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, arranged in a manner suggesting intention rather than accident. They were ancient, discolored by time, some disintegrating into dust. Their exact age would be impossible to determine without specialized analysis, but they had clearly been there for a considerable period. These were the remains of people who had penetrated these depths long before the Cardens, even before the first European settlers, possibly before any historical record of the region. But there was something else, something that made Chandler's heart clench with painful recognition. Among the ancient bones, standing out for their lighter coloration and different state of preservation, were remains that seemed much more recent. A small skull about the size of a child, fragments of tissue not yet fully consumed by time and moisture, and there, partially buried under sediment, a metal object that gleamed when Morrison shone his flashlight on it. It was a belt buckle, the type commonly worn by men of that era, engraved with the initials J.C. The silence that fell over the chamber was absolute, broken only by the sound of the 4 men's heavy breathing. Chandler knelt beside the most recent remains, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of the discovery. Here were the Cardens, or at least what remained of them. After nearly 2 years of searching, theorizing, and speculation, of sleepless nights and exhaustive investigations, the physical answer lay before his eyes. But rather than bringing relief, this discovery only deepened the central mystery. How and why had they gotten there? Morrison began examining the bones with the care of someone who understood the importance of preserving evidence. There were 5 sets of human remains that seemed to correspond in age and size to the members of the Carden family, 2 adults and 3 children. though it was difficult to determine with absolute precision without more detailed forensic analysis. The bones showed no obvious signs of violent trauma. There were no cut marks or fractures to suggest a struggle or attack. It was as if they had simply died there in the depths, far from any possibility of rescue or return. One of the other men, a young man named Patrick O'Connor, began to show signs of panic. His breathing became increasingly rapid and shallow, his eyes wide and fixed on the bones scattered across the cave floor. Chandler recognized the symptoms immediately. Being deep underground, surrounded by death and mystery, was taking its psychological toll. He placed a firm hand on Patrick's shoulder, speaking in a calm but authoritative voice, instructing him to control his breathing and focus on practical, immediate thoughts. They needed to document everything before taking any further action. Chandler had brought paper and pencil and began making rudimentary drawings of the arrangement of the remains, the location of each object, and the paintings on the walls. Every detail would be important later when they were above ground and could analyze the findings with clearer minds in a safer environment. Morrison collected some of the smaller objects that could be transported without compromising the scene, including the belt buckle and some fragments of fabric that still retained their integrity. As they worked, a nagging question lingered in Chandler's mind. If the Cardens had died there, why had some of their belongings been found 15 miles away on the surface, scattered across the mountains? It made no sense. Unless they hadn't all died simultaneously, unless some had managed to escape temporarily, only to meet their own ends elsewhere. Or perhaps there were multiple entrances to this cave system, connections they hadn't yet discovered, tunnels emerging in distant locations. After completing the initial documentation, Chandler made a decision. They needed to explore beyond the chamber to see if there were more tunnels, more answers hidden in the depths. Morrison agreed, though with visible hesitation. Patrick was instructed to return through the rift and wait with the others, as his psychological condition was clearly deteriorating. The fourth man, a seasoned veteran named Marcus Webb, would remain with Chandler and Morrison for further exploration. Opposite the bone chamber, another tunnel opened, narrow and descending. The passage was nearly vertical in places, requiring the use of ropes to descend safely. The depth increased steadily, and Chandler estimated they were already at least 300 meters below the surface, possibly more. The air here was different, thinner, laden with that peculiar odor they had noticed earlier, now intensified to the point of being almost unbearable. After a particularly difficult descent, they reached what appeared to be the deepest point of the cave system explored so far. It was a small, claustrophobic chamber with a low ceiling that forced them to remain crouched. And there, in the center of that confined space, was something that defied rational explanation. It was an opening in the floor, perfectly circular, approximately 3 feet in diameter. It didn't look natural. The edges were too smooth, too uniform, as if they had been cut or polished by clever hands. Morrison held his flashlight over the opening, and all 3 men peered down. The light simply disappeared into the darkness, revealing no bottom or end. They threw a stone into the opening and waited for the sound of impact. Seconds passed. 5, 10, 15. No sound returned. It was an abyss of incomprehensible depth, or else the stone had fallen into something that completely absorbed the impact. Webb suggested that perhaps there was water down there, a deep underground lake that wouldn't produce an audible splash from such a distance. Around the circular opening, etched into the rock with disturbing precision, were more of those ancient symbols. But here, they were different, more elaborate, repeating in patterns that suggested ritual significance or a dire warning. Chandler had a growing sense that they had reached something significant, something ancient people had tried to mark and warn others about. This place was the heart of the mystery, the focal point of centuries of disappearances and tragedies, and somehow the Cardens had been drawn here. The three men remained in that final chamber for an indefinite period, each lost in his own disturbing thoughts. Chandler felt a strange, almost irresistible compulsion to move even closer to that circular opening, to peer deeper into its absolute darkness. It was as if something was calling to him, whispering promises of answers, of understanding, of revelations that transcended ordinary human knowledge. He shook his head vigorously, forcing himself to take a few steps back. It was exactly the kind of irrational feeling that had likely led others, including the Cardens, to their terrible fates. Morrison also felt that inexplicable pull. He mentioned with a trembling voice that he could have sworn he heard voices emerging from the abyss, voices that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place them. Chandler recognized the description immediately. It was exactly what James Carden's note had mentioned. Following voices. These weren't hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen or fear. It was something real, something emanating from that place, a terrifying property that affected the human mind in ways the science of the time couldn't explain or even begin to comprehend. Webb, the most pragmatic of the three, was the one who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. They needed to get out of there immediately. Every additional minute at that depth increased the risk, not only physically, but psychologically. They had already seen enough, discovered more than anyone had expected. To stay any longer would be to tempt fate, as so many others had done before them. Chandler agreed, albeit reluctantly. Part of him wanted to stay, wanted to understand completely. But the rational part recognized the wisdom in Webb's words. The return journey was exhausting, climbing back up the vertical sections of the tunnel, dragging themselves through the widening crevice, navigating the miles of passages until finally reaching the surface. When they emerged from the caverns, it was night. They had been in the depths for nearly 16 hours. The team that had remained at the entrance greeted them with bursts of relief. They had begun to fear that something terrible had happened, that they would need to organize a rescue, or worse, a body recovery. That night, camped near the cave entrance, Chandler gathered the entire team and shared what they had discovered. Some men received the news in solemn silence, others with undisguised tears. After nearly 2 years, the mystery of the Cardens' physical whereabouts was solved, but the mystery of why and how remained as impenetrable as ever. In fact, the discoveries had only added layers of complexity and terror to something already incomprehensible. Over the next few days, a painstaking operation was organized to recover the Carden family's remains. It was delicate and deeply disturbing work. Teams took turns transporting bones and objects from the depths to the surface, treating each fragment with respect and reverence. It took 4 days to complete the recovery. The remains were handed over to county authorities, who arranged a proper funeral, finally giving the family a dignified rest after so long lost in the bowels of the earth. The funeral was held on a cloudy July morning in the small Methodist church the Cardens used to attend. Virtually the entire community attended, many with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of barely concealed fear. The local reverend delivered a sermon on divine mysteries, on how not everything in this world can or should be understood by the human mind, on the importance of faith in the face of the inexplicable. His eyes, however, betrayed his own uncertainty, his own fear of what the mountains hid. Chandler watched the funeral from afar, respectfully distanced from the congregation mourning their finally found dead. He knew his work was not yet complete. There was the official report to be written, conclusions to be presented to state authorities, recommendations to be made about the future of that cave system. But more than that, there was the weight of knowledge he now carried. He had peered into that abyss, had felt its malignant pull, had understood that there were forces in this world that transcended rational explanation. His final report was delivered in August of 1918. It was a carefully crafted document presenting facts objectively and scientifically. It described the discovery of the remains, the exact location where they were found, the objects recovered, and the evidence collected. It mentioned the presence of ancient paintings and structures that suggested prehistoric human occupation of the caves. But there were things Chandler deliberately left out. He didn't mention the circular opening in the depths. He didn't describe the warning symbols surrounding it. He didn't report the inexplicable sensations all the explorers had experienced. His official recommendations were clear and straightforward. The cave system should be officially closed to the public. The main entrance should be sealed with permanent concrete and metal structures. Warning signs should be installed around the property. No one should be allowed to enter those depths again, under any circumstances. State authorities accepted his recommendations without question. The Carden case had cost considerable resources and caused enough public anxiety. Everyone was willing to simply close that dark chapter and move on. Work to seal the caves began in the fall of 1918. A construction crew was hired to erect a permanent barrier at the main entrance, using reinforced concrete and interlocking iron bars to make any future access impossible. The workers carried out their tasks quickly, eager to finish and leave this cursed place. Many reported uncomfortable sensations while working, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes, as if the mountain itself rejected them. Chandler personally oversaw the closure. He remained there until the final layer of concrete was poured, until the final warning signs were installed around the property. The signs were simple and straightforward, warning of the danger of collapse and prohibiting unauthorized entry. They didn't mention the real history of the place, nor did they mention the Cardens or the countless others who had disappeared over the centuries. Some truths, Chandler had concluded, were best left unsaid. Before leaving Cumberland County forever, the investigator visited Eleanor Wright one last time. The old woman welcomed him into her modest cottage, her ancient eyes studying him with an understanding that needed no words. She prepared tea, and the two sat in silence for long minutes before another word was exchanged. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge passed down through generations. She said that some parts of the mountains belonged to forces older than humanity, places where the earth held secrets that should not be disturbed. Chandler asked if she believed they had done the right thing by sealing the caves. Eleanor said yes, but added that human-made barriers were fragile against what lived in the depths. Time would wear away the concrete, people would forget the warnings, and eventually someone would find a way back in. It was always like this. History repeated itself in cycles, generation after generation, because human curiosity was stronger than prudence, because the voices calling from the depths knew exactly how to seduce unsuspecting minds. In the months that followed, Chandler tried to return to normal life in Nashville, resuming his regular duties as a criminal investigator. But the memories of those caves haunted him. He dreamed of the circular opening, of its absolute darkness that seemed to extend beyond known physical dimensions. He dreamed of the voices he had heard, of the almost irresistible pull he had felt, and he wondered in the silent hours of the early morning how many other openings like that existed, scattered throughout the mountains, how many other places where the veil between worlds was too thin. The years passed. The Great War ended, bringing soldiers home and changing the country in profound ways. The 1920s brought prosperity and modernization. Tennessee developed, roads were improved, and small rural communities became better connected to the outside world. The Carden estate was eventually sold by the state, passing through different owners over the decades. None remained for long. All reported feelings of unease, unexplained events, and an atmosphere of disquiet permeating the land. Chandler maintained sporadic correspondence with Sheriff Hodges over the years. In 1932, he received a particularly disturbing letter. Hodges, now retired and aging, wrote about rumors that the concrete barrier at the caves had been partially damaged by a minor earthquake that had struck the region. Local youths had discovered the opening, and some had reportedly attempted to explore inside. 2 of them disappeared for 3 days before being found wandering the mountains, incoherent and unable to explain where they had been or what they had seen. The news filled Chandler with dread. He immediately wrote to state officials, begging for the dam to be repaired and reinforced, and for additional security to be implemented. His letter was received politely, but with little concrete action. The Great Depression had devastated the country. Resources were scarce, and the state had more pressing priorities than sealing caves on remote properties based on events from decades past. Chandler felt helpless, knowing there was nothing he could do but warn. Today, more than a century after the events that consumed the Carden family, those Tennessee mountains remain. The property has changed hands countless times. The barrier has been repaired and breached on multiple occasions over the decades. Locals still speak in whispers about that place, about the old stories of disappearances, about the nights when strange lights are seen dancing among the trees. Few know the full details of what Chandler discovered, as many of his personal records were lost or deliberately destroyed after his death in 1947. The Appalachian Mountains guard their secrets with fierce tenacity. Beneath their verdant forests and picturesque valleys lies a network of caves stretching for countless miles, depths that have yet to be fully mapped or understood. And somewhere in that eternal darkness lies a circular opening that defies explanation, surrounded by warnings left by people who understood, long before us, that some places in this world were not meant to be explored by humanity. The Carden family story remains a grim reminder that not all mysteries can or should be solved, that some questions carry answers that cost more than anyone should be willing to pay. They were ordinary people living simple lives until something in those depths called to them, lured them to a destiny beyond our comprehension. And maybe, just maybe, it's best that it remains this way. Shrouded in shadow and silence, forgotten by future generations who will never need to gaze into that abyss and feel its empty gaze returning.